In the spring of 2009, a soil scientist from the Regional Extension Office stood at the top of a stony pasture in Sanders County, Montana, looked at the ground a young woman wanted to plant, and told her in the kindest voice he had that the north slope would give her nothing but heartbreak and broken tiller blades. He was not a cruel man. He had 2 degrees and 26 years of field reports behind him, and every one of them agreed with the woman's own mother, who had said the same thing for as long as the daughter could remember. Too rocky, too cold, too high. The slope faced the wrong way, and the dirt was thin over gravel, and the frost came early there and left late by every measure the office knew how to take. The man was right. 11 years later, in the autumn of 2020, a buyer for a national kitchen and home company sat at the same farmhouse table and signed a standing order for the dried flour and the oil that came off that exact slope. An order large enough that the woman had to hire 4 of her neighbors to help her fill it. The number on the contract would have bought the whole farm twice over in 2009. This is the story of the years between those 2 days, and of a daughter, a mother, a dead grandmother's notebook, and a hillside that everyone who measured it called worthless, and one person learned to read. Let me tell you about Greta Vance, because the slope is hers, and you cannot understand the ground without understanding the woman who refused to give up on it. In 2009, she was 28 years old recently, back in the valley after 6 years away, with a degree in plant biology from a state university and a marriage that had ended quietly and without anyone to blame. She had grown up on the farm, 80 acres of bottomland along a creek and another 40 of slope rising north away from the water, and she had spent her childhood believing, the way her mother believed, that the slope was the part of the place you apologized for. The bottom grew good, alfalfa. The slope grew rock. She was known in the valley for 2 things. She was quiet, to the point that people sometimes mistook it for coldness, and she could remember the exact location of things nobody else had bothered to notice: the wet spot in a field, the corner where the wind always cut, the row that ripened 3 days ahead of the rest. Her mother, Ada, called it being particular. Greta thought of it as paying attention, which is a different thing, and the difference is the whole story. Ada Vance was 71 that spring, a widow for 9 years, and she ran the bottom land the way her late husband had run it and his father before him. Alfalfa and a little barley, sold to the dairies down the valley, the margins thin and getting thinner. She loved her daughter, and she was frightened for her, and the 2 feelings came out of her mouth as the same sentence repeated often. You cannot make a living off that hill. Nobody ever has. Your grandmother tried, and it broke her. That last part was the part Greta could not let go of. Your grandmother tried. Because there had been a grandmother, Ingrid, who came over from a hard valley in Norway in 1921 and married into the place and lived on it until she died in 1974, the year before Greta was born. Greta knew her only as a name and a face in 2 photographs and a smell that supposedly clung to the back bedroom for years, a clean, sharp herbal smell nobody could account for. And Greta knew one more thing about Ingrid, which was that somewhere in the house there was a notebook. She found it in the autumn of 2009, after the extension man had come and gone and her mother had said her piece in a cedar chest in the attic, under 3 quilts and a christening gown. It was a ledger, kind a store would have used, bound in cracked black cloth, and it was full, front to back, of a small slanted hand writing partly in English and partly in Norwegian. Greta sat on the attic floor with a flashlight until 2 in the morning and could not read, most of it. What she could read changed the direction of her life. Ingrid had not been writing about alfalfa. Ingrid had been writing about the slope. Let me tell you what was in that notebook, because it is the seed of everything that came after. Ingrid Vance had grown up in a part of Norway where the good flat land belonged to other people, and the poor families farmed the hillsides, the thin, dry, stony, south-facing cuts where nothing valuable was supposed to grow. And on those hillsides, her own mother had grown lavender. Not the soft, fat lavender of a wet English garden, but a hard, narrow-leafed mountain strain that wanted exactly what the slope in Montana offered, and what every other crop on that farm hated. It wanted poor soil. It wanted gravel that drained fast and never held the roots in standing water. It wanted a cold winter to force it dormant, and a south or open exposure to bake it in summer. It wanted, in short, to be neglected by everyone who knew how to farm well. Ingrid had brought seed with her in 1921, sewn into the hem of a coat. She had planted it on the north slope, which is open and high and drains like a sieve, and according to the notebook it had grown, and she had cut it and dried it, and sold small bundles and stilled a little oil in a copper pot for 40 years. And then she had grown old, and her son, Greta's grandfather, a practical man who believed in alfalfa, had let the lavender go back to brush after she died because there was no money in it that he could see, and the hillside was needed for nothing, which is to say it was not needed at all. Stay with me here, because this is the part where most people would have closed the notebook and gone back down to the bottomland. Greta did not. I want you to think about what it takes to bet the next decade of your life on a dead woman's handwriting in a language you cannot fully read against the living advice of every qualified person you know. Greta thought about it for one winter. Then she went up the slope in March with a soil probe and a frost thermometer, and she started taking the measurements her grandmother had taken, and she found that the old woman had been right about every single one. The slope drained. Water poured through that gravel and was gone in an hour, where the bottomland stayed soggy into May. The slope was cold in winter, colder than the valley floor, a hard, killing, dormant cold. And the slope, being open and tilted up toward the southern sky for most of its length, despite facing north at the top, caught more hours of direct summer sun than any flat field on the place. Every quality the Extension Office had written down as a defect was, for this one particular plant, a requirement. In the spring of 2010, Greta planted her first eighth of an acre of lavender on the north slope. From cuttings she raised in the farmhouse window off 4 surviving plants she found gone wild in the old patch, the great-grandmother's strain still alive under the brush after 36 years. Her mother watched her carry water up the hill and said nothing for a long time, and then said the things she would say in one form or another for the next 4 years. You are putting your back into rock, Greta. That is all that hill has ever given anybody. The extension man came back that summer, a courtesy visit, and stood at the bottom of the slope, looking up at the small gray-green rows with an expression Greta had learned to recognize on educated faces. His name was Dale Brunner, and I want to be fair to him, because he was not a fool, and he was not unkind. He was a man whose entire training told him that productive ground was deep, dark, moist, and level, and that a thin, dry, north-tilted gravel slope was the worst ground on the farm. He had a clipboard and a soil map, and the soil map agreed with him. He told her gently that lavender was a hobby crop, a boutique thing that she might sell a few bundles at a farmer's market, but that she would never make a living, and that the smart move was to put the hill back to pasture and lease it for grazing if she wanted a few dollars off it. He called it that day a nice little project. He meant it warmly. It landed like a slap, and Greta said only one thing back to him. She said, "My grandmother fed a family off this hill for 40 years." Which brings us back to the question of two kinds of knowing, because that is what was standing on the slope that afternoon, one on each end of it. Dale Brunner knew a great deal about soil in general. He could tell you the average behavior of 10,000 acres. What he could not do, what his whole profession is not built to do, was know one specific hillside the way a person knows it, who has measured its frost dates and watched its water disappear and held its gravel in her hand and read 40 years of one dead woman's notes on how it behaves in a dry July. He knew the map. Greta was learning the territory. The map is faster, and it is right almost everywhere. And that is exactly why the places it is wrong stay hidden so long. Let me tell you about Lavender, because the mechanism matters, and the reveal will not mean anything if you do not understand why the slope works. Lavender is a Mediterranean and mountain plant, and its great enemy in cultivation is not cold, and it is not poor soil. Its great enemy is wet feet. Lavender roots sitting in water through a wet spring rot from a fungus that takes the plant down from the crown, and a single soggy season can kill a whole field. The rich bottom land that grew such good alfalfa, the deep moisture-holding soil that every farmer in the valley wanted, was death to Lavender. It held water against the roots exactly when the plant could not stand it. The thin gravel of the north slope, the soil that could not hold a crop of anything the county knew how to sell, drained so hard and so fast that the roots were never wet for more than a few hours, and the plant thrived in the one condition no good field could give it. And the cold did a second thing. The hard winter dormancy, the killing freeze that ran the slope colder than the valley floor, concentrated the oils. A lavender plant that never quite goes dormant, that grows soft through a mild winter, makes a thin, weak oil. A plant forced down hard by real cold and then baked through a high-altitude summer with intense direct sun makes oil that is dense and high in the compounds that give lavender its scent and its value. Ingrid had known this in her hands without the chemistry. The slope was not a bad field for lavender. It was, Greta came to understand, over 3 seasons of cutting and stilling and measuring, very possibly one of the best lavender sites in the whole northern Rockies. And it had sat under brush for 36 years because everyone who looked at it was asking it the wrong question. They asked what it could grow. The answer was almost nothing. The right question was what it could grow that wanted nothing else. And to that question, the slope had one magnificent answer. I will tell you now about the foil in this story because his path runs alongside Greta's the whole way, and you should hold the two together. His name was Marcus Pruitt, and he farmed the next place over 400 acres of good bottom ground, and in 2010 he was the man everyone in the valley pointed to as doing it right. Marcus had gone all in on the modern model. He had borrowed against his land and bought a center-pivot irrigation system and put nearly his whole acreage into a single high-value contract crop, seed potatoes for a processor 3 counties away, on a contract that paid well as long as he hit the grade and the volume every year. He had a new tractor with a cab you could not hear yourself think in and a sprayer rig that cost more than Greta's truck and house combined. To the bank, he was the best kind of customer. To the processor, he was a reliable unit of supply. To the valley, he was proof that the smart, scaled, modern way was the way to survive. Greta liked Marcus. Everyone did. He was generous with equipment and quick to help pull a calf or a stuck truck, and when he told her, more than once, leaning on her fence, that she was wasting the best years of her life on a flower patch, he said it the way you warn a friend, not the way you mock one. He was not wrong by the numbers anyone could see. In 2012, Greta sold $1,100 of dried lavender at 3 farmers' markets and spent most of it on more cuttings. She would load the truck before dawn on a Saturday, Juno riding the bench seat with her nose at the crack of the window, and set up a folding table under a borrowed canopy between a man selling huckleberry jam and a woman selling goat soap, and she would stand there all morning bundling stems with twine, while people picked up a sprig, held it to their faces, said how lovely, and bought a $4 bundle or did not. At the end of one of those mornings, she counted $38 in a coffee can and drove home and did not tell her mother the figure. That same year, Marcus cleared a sum he did not name out loud, but that bought a second pivot. The gap between them was enormous, and it was visible, and it pointed in one direction. And even Greta, on the bad nights, lying awake doing the arithmetic her daughter would later do out loud, wondered if her mother and Dale Brunner and Marcus were simply right. Then her daughter came home, and the story got harder before it got easier. Let me tell you about Nora, because she is the one who almost talked Greta off the hill, and because she is the one who ends up carrying it forward. Nora was Greta's only child, born in 2003, raised partly on the farm and partly at her father's place in town, and in 2021 she came back to the valley at 18 with a freshly won scholarship to study agricultural economics and a head full of everything a sharp 18-year-old learns in her first hard look at a family business. She loved her mother. She was also that first summer home, quietly mortified by the lavender. She had run the numbers, real numbers, the way her professors taught, and the numbers said the farm was carrying the slope at a loss, and had been for years, and that the sensible thing was to lease the bottom to a bigger operator, sell the oil equipment, and let her mother rest. Wait, I have the years tangled, and I owe you a correction. Because in this story, the dates carry the weight, and I will not blur them. Nora was born in 1991, not 2003, which makes her the 18-year-old who came home in 2009, the very autumn Greta found the notebook. And it is Nora, not a younger child, who stood at the bottom of the slope with Dale Brunner's logic in her mouth for the better part of the next decade. Let me tell it straight from here, because the truth of it is better than the tangle. Nora came home in the autumn of 2009-18, sharp, halfway to a degree she would finish by correspondence, and she sided with her grandmother and the extension man for years, not out of meanness, but out of arithmetic. She kept the books for the farm starting in 2011, and the books told her plainly that the lavender lost money every year through 2014. She would sit at the kitchen table with the ledger open under the single hanging light and tell her mother, in the level voice of someone who has done the math twice, that love for a dead woman's notebook was not a business plan. Greta did not argue with her. That was the thing Nora could not get past in those years. Her mother never argued. She would listen and nod and say that the plants were not finished telling her what they could do, and go back up the hill in the morning. There was an animal in this, and I have kept her back until now on purpose because she belongs in the quiet places of the story. Her name was Juno, a blue heeler. Greta took on as a pup in 2010, and for the next 12 years that dog went up the north slope every single morning at Greta's heel and lay at the end of the rows, while Greta worked and came down at dusk, smelling of lavender so strong that Nora swore she could find the dog in the dark. Juno was on the slope the morning the first real cutting came in. She was on the slope the day everything nearly ended, and she would be on the slope at the very end of this, which I will come to. By 2014, Greta had a little over 2 acres planted and was distilling oil in a proper small copper still she had bought, used from an orchard in Oregon, and she had learned the craft the way her grandmother learned it, by getting it wrong. The cut had to come at the right hour of the right day, after the dew burned off, and before the afternoon heat drove the oil back down into the plant, with the flowers just opened and not yet browning. Cut wrong, and the oil was thin. Cut right, and a small batch of the slope's hard mountain lavender threw an oil so strong that a single drop filled a room. He lost a whole batch in 2013 by cutting a day too late in a heat wave, the flowers already going brown at the tips, and the oil that came off the still that night smelled flat and grassy, and she poured it out on the gravel and stood in the dark furious at herself, and learned the lesson for good. After that, she watched the rows the way a person watches bread in an oven, walking them at 6 in the morning and again at noon, reading the color and the dew and the heat, and she came to know within a single day when each block was ready. And Juno learned the rhythm too, and would wait by the still-room door on a cutting morning before Greta had said a word. Nora, keeping the books, noticed something in 2014 that did not fit her own argument. The oil was selling. Not in bundles at a market for a few dollars, but in tiny bottles by mail, to people who had bought it once and written back, asking for more and telling their friends. The margin on the oil was nothing like the margin on the dried flour. The slope was small, and it would always be small. But what it made was not a commodity. It was the opposite of a commodity. It was a thing there was very little of, and that no large farm could make. That was the first crack in Nora's certainty, and being an honest person, she let it widen. Which brings me to a thing I want to say to you directly, just for a moment. If you have ever watched someone in your own family put their whole stubborn heart into a thing the rest of you were sure would fail, you know exactly what kind of quiet that kitchen table held in those years, and I would be glad to know your version of it. Now, let me get back to the slope. Because in 2015, the question stopped being whether the lavender could pay and became whether anyone outside the valley could be made to see what it was. The middle years were slow, and I will not pretend they were not. From 2014 to 2018, Greta built the thing one customer at a time. She added a half-acre a year as cuttings allowed, never borrowing, never planting more than she could cut by hand in the narrow window the oil demanded, refusing on principle the one path everyone suggested, which was to scale up, take a loan, plant 10 acres, and chase volume. Dale Brunner, who had become something closer to a friendly skeptic over the years and stopped by once a season, told her in 2016 that she had proved her point, that she could grow the stuff, and that now was the time to go big or stay a hobby. He used the word again, hobby. The second time in the story he fastened it to her work, and this time it landed differently, because by then Greta knew something he did not. She knew that the moment she planted the wet bottom land to lavender to chase acreage, the fungus would take it, and the very thing that made her oil worth what it was worth, the hard slope and the slow hand cut, could not be scaled without destroying it. To go big was to lose the only advantage she had. She told Brunner she would stay exactly as small as the good ground allowed, and he shook his head and called it leaving money on the table, and drove off in his clean office truck, and was for the third and last time in this story certain and wrong. Marcus, meanwhile, was getting bigger. By 2017, he farmed close to 700 acres. Most of it leased, all of it under the same kind of single-crop high-input contract that had made him the Valley's model of success. He had 3 pivots, and a crew, and a line of credit that would have frightened a more nervous man, And every year the contract demanded a little more volume at a little tighter margin. And every year he planted the same crop on the same ground and bought the same inputs and ran a little faster to stay in place. He was not a fool any more than Brunner was. He was doing precisely what the whole structure around him rewarded. The system measured his volume and his grade and his reliability, and by those measures he was excellent. The system did not measure his fragility, because fragility does not show up on a spreadsheet until the year it arrives all at once. It arrived in 2018. Let me tell you what happened in 2018, because it is the hinge the whole story turns on. And it did not come for Greta, it came for the valley. And it found out who had built on rock and who had built on sand, and it turned out the rock was the safe place all along. The summer of 2018 was the hottest and driest the county had recorded. The creek that fed the bottomland dropped through July, and the senior water rights upstream took their share first, the way the law allows, and by the first week of August the irrigators down the valley were getting a fraction of the water their crops needed it exactly. Marcus's potatoes, bred and contracted for a steady deep drink from the pivots, hit the heat and the short water in their critical bulking weeks and never recovered. The grade fell apart. A potato that does not size and does not finish clean does not meet the contract, and a contract crop that misses grade is not sold cheaper. It is very often not sold at all. And the same heat and the same drought did something almost nobody in the valley was positioned to notice. Up on the north slope, the lavender, a dryland Mediterranean plant that had spent every previous year complaining silently that Montana was wetter than it liked, had the best season of its life. It does not want the creek. It never did. The hard drought that broke the bottomland was, to the slope, simply a good, dry Mediterranean summer. The weather the plant came from the other side of the world to find. Greta's 2.5 acres, cut at the right hour by the same hands that had always cut them, through the strongest oil she had ever stilled. To the valley, 2018 was a disaster. To the north slope, it was the year the plant finally got the summer it had been waiting 100 years to have. I want to be careful here because the niche I work in loves a tidy reckoning, and the truth is never tidy. Marcus did not lose everything in a day. He lost it the slow, grinding way. Over the following 18 months, as the missed contract turned into a missed payment, turned into a renegotiation, turned into the bank declining to extend the operating line for 2019. He sold the newest pivot first, then the big tractor, then 120 acres of the leased ground went back to its owners. And by the spring of 2020, Marcus Pruitt was farming a quarter of what he had farmed 3 years before, and doing it scared. The narrator's job here is not to gloat over him. He followed the best advice the system had, and the system's advice was fragile, in a way no one was paid to mention, and a good man paid for that fragility. There is no lesson in this story worth a neighbor's ruin, and Greta, who liked Marcus, did not for one moment celebrate. She brought him a jar of honey and a bottle of oil and sat on his porch and said almost nothing, which, from Greta, was a great deal. He turned the little bottle over in his hands, a man who had bought sprayers that cost more than her whole operation, and asked her, not bitterly, just tired, how a few acres of flowers on the worst ground in the county were the thing still standing when everything he had done right was coming apart. Greta did not have a speech for him and would not have given one if she had. She said the slope had never wanted the creek, that was all. That the dry year that broke him was the year the plant had been homesick for. Marcus looked out at his own steep, stony upper ground, the acres he had never been able to do a thing with, and said nothing for a while, and then said he supposed he had spent 20 years farming the good half of his land and apologizing for the rest, same as everybody. Greta said her family had done the very same thing for 50 years until her grandmother's notebook taught her otherwise. They sat until the light went down off the fields, and she left the bottle with him. Through 2019, the oil from the strong 2018 cut did something on its own. A chef at a resort over the divide had bought a few bottles and put the oil into a dessert and a shortbread served at the resort restaurant, and a food writer ate the shortbread and asked where the lavender came from, and the answer, a thin, rocky north slope in Sanders County stilled by hand by one woman off her great-grandmother's Norwegian strain, was exactly the kind of answer that travels ought. By the summer of 2020, Greta was getting calls she did not know how to take from people who used words like provenance and single origin, and she let Nora take the calls because Nora, by then, was 30 years old, had finished her degree, had spent 4 years watching the slope make a liar of every number she had once trusted, and had quietly become the best advocate the Lavender ever had. Which brings us at last to the autumn of 2020, and to the table, and to the number. The buyer came in October. She represented a national kitchen and home company, the kind that puts a small number of carefully chosen specialty goods under its own name, and she had been sent because the chef's lavender shortbread had become a thing people asked about, and the company wanted the source. She was not a romantic. She had flown into Missoula and driven 2 hours, and she had in her bag the results of a lab analysis of a bottle of Greta's oil that she had bought quietly through the resort, and she sat at Ada Vance's old kitchen table under the same hanging light where Nora had once argued the lavender was a fool's errand. And she put a single sheet of paper face down on the wood and said she wanted to talk about a standing order. Ada was there. She was 82, slower but sharp, and she had spent 11 years saying the slope was too rocky. And she sat at the end of the table with her hands folded and said nothing. Nora was there with the books. Juno was under the table with her chin on Greta's boot. The buyer turned the paper over. The number was the company's first-year order in dollars for the oil and the dried flour combined, and it was a number that Greta had to read twice because the decimals seemed to be in the wrong place. It was more in that 1 year's order than the entire bottomland had earned from alfalfa in the previous 11 years, put together. Nobody spoke. The buyer let it sit, the way people do when they know the paper has done the work. Greta did not gasp, and she did not smile in triumph, because that was not in her. She looked at the number, and then she looked down the table at her mother. And her mother, who had been wrong for 11 years and was honest enough to know it, looked back at the sheet of paper, and then up at the rocky slope, through the kitchen window where the last cut rows stood gray-green in the October light. And Ada Vance said the only thing there was to say. She said, "Your grandmother would have known what to do with that." And that was the closest thing to an apology a proud old woman could make, and from Greta's face it was enough. The buyer had one condition, and it was the condition that decided everything, and it is the condition that tells you Greta had been right to refuse to scale all those years. The company did not want more. It wanted exactly this. It wanted the hand cut, and the small slope, and the single origin, and the story that was true, and it was willing to pay, per pound, a price no bulk lavender on earth could command, precisely because there was so little of it, and it could not be made any other way. The thing the system had called a fatal weakness for 11 years, that it was small and slow and could not scale, turned out at the only time horizon that finally mattered to be the entire source of its worth. Let me tell you how Dale Brunner found out, because the niche I work in promises you the expert's recalibration, and this one I am glad to give you, because it was gentle and it was real. Bruna heard about the contract the way everyone in a small county hears things, and he drove out one afternoon in the spring of 2021, parked his clean office truck at the bottom of the slope, and walked up the rows for the first time in all those years instead of standing at the bottom and looking. Greta was cutting. He stood at the end of a row and watched her work for a while, and then he said, "I told you that hill would give you nothing." And Greta said, "You did." And he said, "I had the whole county's soil data, and I was wrong about one hillside, and I have been thinking about why. It was not a man being humiliated. It was a good scientist running into the edge of his own instrument and being honest about it." Greta showed him the notebook that afternoon, and the frost records, and the drainage measurements. Her grandmother and then she had kept for nearly a century between them, and Brunner, who had spent a career reading averages, spent 2 hours reading one place, and when he left he asked if he could bring a soils class out the following spring to see what a slope looked like when somebody had finally asked it the right question. He brought them every year after that. The method spread, the way these things do when the person who has it does not hold it close. Greta did not get rich in the way Marcus had once looked rich, and she did not want to. She kept the operation exactly the size the good slope allowed, 4 acres at its largest, and when the demand outran what one slope could supply, she did the thing that tells you who she was. She did not borrow and plant the bottom and ruin the oil. She found the other thin, rocky, north-tilted hillsides in the county, the worthless slopes nobody farmed, on Marcus's place and 3 others, and she taught those neighbors her grandmother's strain and her own hard-won craft, and she bought their cut at a fair standing price and stilled it with her own, so that the worthless hills all over the valley started paying their owners better than the good bottomland ever had. Marcus planted 11 acres of his steepest, stoniest, most useless ground to Ingrid's Lavender in 2022, the ground he had never been able to do a thing with, and it carried him back from the edge the contract crop had driven him to. The thing that saved him was the ground the system had taught him to despise. Nora runs the books still, and more than the books now. She finished her degree and came home for good in 2015 and never seriously left again. And somewhere in those middle years, the skeptic with the arithmetic became the keeper of the strain. She is the one who took Ingrid's notebook to a translator and had the Norwegian rendered into English at last, and found in the back pages not just frost dates and cut times, but a few lines her great-great-grandmother had written about why she planted on the poor ground, which came down roughly to one plain sentence: "The good land is already spoken for by people who can outbid you, but the land they have thrown away will belong to whoever learns to love it." Nora had that line printed and framed, and it hangs in the still room now, the only words on any wall of the operation. Let me tell you about the last morning I want to leave you with, because the slope deserves to be the final thing you see and not the contract. Juno, the blue healer, lived to be 12 and died in the autumn of 2022 on the slope, on a clear, cold morning of nothing but old age, lying at the end of a cut row in the place she had lain every working morning of her life. Greta buried her there, at the top of the north slope, in the gravel that drained so hard and so fast, under the rose of the plant that came in a coat hem from a hard valley in Norway 101 years before. From that spot, on a clear morning, you can see the whole valley, the good bottomland along the creek where the alfalfa grows, the level fields everyone always wanted, and the thin rocky hillsides ringing the valley above them, the slopes everyone always apologized for. Gray-green now, in long rows, clear up the county, throwing an oil into the autumn air. so strong you could find your way home by it in the dark. The extension office had taken every measurement it knew how to take, and every measurement was correct, and the conclusion was wrong because the office was measuring whether the slope was good ground, and good ground was never the question. The question was whether anyone would spend the years it took to learn what one particular thin, cold, rocky hillside, asked the right thing, could do better than the best field in the valley. A spreadsheet can tell you the average of 10,000 acres in an afternoon. It cannot tell you the one place where the average is a lie, and it never could, because the average is built precisely by burying the exceptions, and the whole worth of a place like the North Slope is that it is an exception nobody bothered to dig back up. Greta Vance dug it up. She did it with a flashlight in an attic and a frost thermometer in March, and a dead woman's handwriting and 12 years of carrying water up a hill her mother told her to leave alone. The land everyone threw away belonged, in the end, to the one who learned to love it. That was the whole of her grandmother's wisdom, and it took 100 years and a drought and a contract to prove it, and the proof, when it came, was a slope full of flowers on the worst ground in the county, drying in the wind, smelling of a value no instrument the office owned had ever known how to measure. What is rigid breaks in a hard year. What is rooted in the right poor ground holds and feeds you and outlasts the people who called it worthless. The slope was never too rocky. It was only ever waiting to be read.